I want to invite you to sit down beside me and look through the book that I wrote in 2012. This is a poster here in front that really pulls it all together. It shows a picture of the front of the book, some of the old historical photographs, and one of the maps. This was what was advertised when we brought these books out in 2012. The picture on the front of our book is one of the most interesting I've ever seen in researching whiskey. It is the interior of a still house at New Hope. New Hope had 2 distilleries there, and this picture really shows the interior in the 1890s. One of the interesting things about it is this light bulb. There's 2 light bulbs you can see here. Now, a light bulb in the 1890s was a novelty, and it certainly was a novelty in the still house in the distillery. And I'll come back to that in a few minutes when we get to New Hope. We're going to start out in the Bardstown area with distilleries. We have a map that shows all the different ones. There are 27 that are listed in here. Some of them go outside the county lines, like over in Bullitt and down in LaRue. We have a glossary of the map and the distilling terms. I'm not going to give you a college course in distilling and whiskey making. I'm just going to take you through, show you some pictures, maybe whet your interest a little. That's kind of a bad pun, but get you a little interested in this industry that has been so important to Nelson County for over 200 years. Beam and Hart, also known as Old Tub Distillery. Now, the Beam family is very well known in distilling. Jacob Beam came in the 1790s, and the descendants of his family have continuing to be distillers today in Nelson County and in Bullitt County. This information I mentioned before that was published in 1896, I took completely directly from the publication. So it's not my conversation about who married who and how many children they had and all. It was the editor of the Nelson County Record of 1890s. I had to take it from 1896 up to 1920, and sometimes a little bit further if I said the distillery is still operating today and all of that. Well, D.M. Beam and Sons had a small distillery out on what we call the Nazareth Road. This is on the railroad, right close to Nazareth Convent here in Bardstown. In 1891, you can see here at the map, it had wooden buildings. The yellow, remember, is wooden. Had a still house. It looks like they had a couple of empty warehouses, and these had 500 barrels. That had 500 barrels. And the bonded warehouse had 2,000 barrels. So it looks like they had 3,000 barrels in 1891. Doesn't sound like much of a distillery now when we have 20,000 barrel warehouses. In 1886, which is earlier, this is what it looked like. Same place for the distillery. These are mash tubs here. You still had the wooden buildings. You had no watchmen, no lights, and they used cordwood for fuel. When they had their still running, they were using wood in there to cause it the heat. This is the distillery, the map of it in 1910, so quite a growth there in 20 years, more than 20 years. It's known as Clear Springs in 1910, big bonded warehouses. Now, what's a bonded warehouse? That is the one that the government is guaranteeing that the whiskey that is being taken from that warehouse is 100 proof. And the bond is the government bond. That's why you have the government man there watching what's going on and taking care of all the records and things like this. Many bonded warehouses, big jump in whiskey. And this was typical. When you start seeing these maps, you'll see a small distillery, and 25 years later, they're really running right along here. That was out on the Nazareth Road, close to where Nazareth Convent is. In fact, this is a distiller's report that D.M. Beam, which is David M. Beam, who is Jim Beam's father. He made this report in 1886 in June. He had 669 barrels, and he paid a $10.70 tax on them. But he had to report that, and these records are in our local courthouse. Now, Henry Sutherland, I always love the picture of his little distillery, and I shouldn't say his little distillery, but that's what it was. It almost looked like a moonshine operation. But he had a really good reputation for making good whiskey. You can kind of see with some of the small pictures here, warehouses up on the hill. This is part of their operation. This is the covered bridge over the Beech Fork River south of Bardstown. So if you were going to Henry Sutherland's to get some whiskey, you were going to cross over this bridge. This is what his distillery looked like in 1886. Very small. Here's your warehouse that was up on the hill. This is the carriage house, and that was part of his plantation, I think. And then you had the mash. This is the distillery part with the still, the meal room, the fermenters. They would only yield 3 barrels a day, so almost like a personal distillery. This picture is ladies over at Yellowstone Distillery at Gethsemane in 1905. They were working in the bottling house then, in the early 1900s. Mr. Sutherland's distillery, though, as you can see, it went from distillery, one warehouse, to where he has 2 big bonded warehouses. He has a corn crib, he has some more building, scales, and here's the bigger distillery part. And that's what, this is 1910, this is 1886. The reason I could do this, could put these long maps in here, I have to give credit to the publisher at New Hope, the St. Martin de Porres print shop in New Hope, Kentucky. They came up with the way that they could make a map that folds in here so you could have a nice size book that wouldn't cost you an awful lot of money. If you'd had to make it big enough for the maps, it might have been out of the reach of a lot of people. Boone and Brothers Distillery was another distillery here along the road to Loretta. This is a very good picture of it. This is an 1894 picture, and if you look up here, you can see the same thing in 1896. I love the pictures of the people who worked in it with their handlebar mustaches, and of course all the men have hats on. And this one has somebody sitting up in the window of the distillery. It was sold in 1903, who moved it to Chicago, Kentucky, and Marion County. I bet you didn't know there was a Chicago in Marion County, but it's before you get to Loretta, along the railroad tracks. In 1912, they added it all together with another distillery. So people sold distilleries then just like they do now. They continued to add them, and they bought the brands, and they also bought the buildings and the manpower too. This picture has nothing to do with Browning Brothers, but this is cattle pens. Anybody that knows about distilling knows that you have leftover product. Once you take the whiskey from the fermented mash, you've got to get rid of the slop, as we call it. Well, most distillers fed it to animals. These maps, I'll start pointing out the cattle sheds, the hog pens. They literally, instead of trying to truck it away or put it in they couldn't put it in the creeks. That was against the law, and they got fined if they did, just like they would today. And this is Greenbar, which is out toward Woodlawn. Greenbar Distillery. This is a brand new cattle shed in 1910, which said it would hold 800 head of cattle. And they were going to feed them slop from their production. These are the Boone and Brother distilleries I mentioned a little earlier. This is on the Beach Fork and Loretta Pike. They even had a whiskey pipe that ran over the top of the road, elevated pipe that would go over to the warehouse to fill the barrels. But here's their cattle shed. They're going to have to feed this is their slop pipe to go down and feed their cattle. This is 1894, same type of thing, and here is 1910, where again they have their still over here, their distillery, and here's their warehouses, the bonded warehouses. But still very small. They produced 50 bushels a day, 4.5 gallons a bushel. No, I didn't do the arithmetic there, but you can figure that out. It's not very much. And it wasn't quantity that they wanted to do in terms of distilling. They wanted a good product. Everybody had pride in their product, and that was what we were working on there. You'll see these little sheets throughout this paper. When we made the maps, we had a lot of white space, and I don't like white space, so I went out looking for more pictures and things to illustrate this book. And this is a wholesale price list of $18.95. Now, if you wanted to buy a barrel of whiskey in $18.95, and you wanted it from Jack Beam is also early times. Jack Beam, this company had 20 barrels of Jack Beam that had been produced in the spring of 1892, and you would pay 42.5 cents a gallon for the barrels, the amount of whiskey in each barrel, each gallon in each barrel. This was in 1895, so that whiskey was only 3 years old. Now, some of them, here's a spring of 1880, and you were going to pay $4.85 a gallon, just like we do now. The older the whiskey, the more money you pay for it. But a lot of these will have some Nelson County whiskeys on it. S.P. Lancaster Distillery was close to Bardstown, one of the closest ones. It was out on the railroad track, close to where our factories are today. The trim masters and the factories along there. Distilleries are placed where they have a good source of water. I should have told you this earlier, but they didn't just up and put themselves down along a railroad track or along a road. They first had to find a good spring, a really good limestone spring, so that the water they were using created a good product. The corn, the grains that they used, they could get locally. They would contract with farmers to bring them to them and all. But getting the water was important. You not only had to have it to create your whiskey, you had to have it to cool down your fermented mash and to cool down the still. Once you had heated the whiskey up, or the fermented mixture up, and the whiskey came off and it ran through the copper worm in the still, you had to run water over it so it would condense. So having water was as important as having grain. You can always bring the grain to it, but trying to bring that much water to a distillery would have been a problem. When the distillery many of these distilleries built along the railroads close to springs. They were always looking for a good source of water, but having a way to ship their product was another. This is 1886. They have their distillery and they have 2 warehouses. Both of them are bonded. 3,000 barrels in this one. That was pretty good. Here's their whiskey pipe. So they were making it in the distillery and they were pumping it over and filling the barrels. Instead of filling the barrels here and having to take them to the warehouses, they pumped them over there and filled the barrels in the warehouse. Same thing here, but you have a few more warehouses. Got a big one over here that's not on here. This is a corn crib. We think of corn cribs as feeding animals. In their case, they have gathered up the corn so that they can grind it and use it in making the mash. This one was making 400 bushels a day, and they were making 4.5 gallons a bushel, which is kind of what's normal. They operated about 5.5 months of the year. We look at our distilleries producing almost 9 months, 10 months a year at least, but 5.5 months. First of all, they have spring and fall. In the summer, sometimes the water would dry up and they wouldn't have enough water. Not necessarily their springs, but some of the other sources they had. So they were always trying to plan around Mother Nature on that part. Tom Moore. Now today you hear of Tom Moore. Tom Moore Distillery is what we were calling Barton's, and then it's now operated by Sazerac, but we call it the 1792 Distillery. That's one thing about distilleries. You can change their names. It's more difficult to change their locations because, again, where they're located is the best place for them to produce whiskey. Their warehouses are up on top of hills where they can get the breeze and the weather. They also can use Mother Nature and gravity to get rid of things that they want to whether it's their slop lines or whether it's just trying to their used water that they cool their stills down with. This was in 1889 when Tom Moore was established, and it was established by a man, Tom Moore, who, and you can see him here, Thomas S. Moore. He had been in partnership with a Mr. Mattingly, and he and Mr. Mattingly fell out. And he went down the road about 100 feet and started another distillery. And when you start looking at the fact they were just side by side almost down what we now call Barton Road, I wondered how they got along, but I guess they must have because they both produced whiskey for some time there. They were using the same source of water. You hear about the big fights out west with the cowboys and the ranchers fighting over water rights. Well, they must have gotten along pretty good because they were using the same spring to produce their whiskey. This is an 1891 map. You've got your 4,500 barrels of whiskey in here, which means it was a good size warehouse. It wasn't one floor. This one says it's seven floor warehouse here. Here's your still house, or your distilling, slop tubs over here, a hay shed. That's in 91, but I want to show you in 1910, they've got a stone section. They have built stone now instead of the frame. That helps with the fire situation. Got another warehouse, and this is the Bardstown New Haven Pike. This would be the way you would have left Bardstown and gone to New Haven until 1935. Bardstown New Haven Pike went right down in the middle of all this distilling on what we would also used to call the Green River Turnpike. This creek, it's a run that's still going through there today. And when we get to this next one, Mattingly and Moore Distillery, you'll see where over the creek they had their cattle sheds, which definitely was a pollution problem. right up the creek. Let's see, here we go. This is 1910. Here's your New Haven, Bardstown Road. This is Tom Moore right here. Right there would be Tom Moore, and right up here is Mattingly Moore. This is the 1886 version, which had a stone warehouse. Now, I don't know what brick and stone warehouses, how they helped with the aging of whiskey. I feel like there'd be some problems in it. Most people had frame ones, but this has the stone one, like over here. The cattle shed. There are 3 cattle sheds along here, and they're right over the creek. They're pumping their slop to them from the distillery. They don't say how many cows they have in them, but they're pretty good size. Meanwhile, all your local traffic's going right down between Mattingly and Moore. There are warehouses up on the hill, and they even have down the flow line. If any of this starts burning or something, this is an insurance map. So they were looking to see what kind of situations might come up. If one of these warehouses started burning, it would run down here into this, and so that the people who were insuring this had an idea about the problems that might come up with this. They operated about 1 month of the year. Now that doesn't sound very good. They had 300 bushels a day. It must be 7 months. That can't be a 1. That's the thing about old maps here. That must be 7 months a year. But they didn't have a watchman. They had steam power, and they had closed lamps for light. And they had a 100-foot hose in the distillery, which I guess helps fight. I don't know whether they had any type of steam engine to pump the water or not. This is 1894, what it looked like at that time. I'm going through quickly. I'm tempted to tell you everything that's in the book, but you're going to have to go to the library and get it, or if you want to buy one, I have them available. I'm almost out of them. They've been out 2 years, and I self-published this, so I only had maybe 400 or 500 copies. This is an old Mattingly Moore bottle, pre-Prohibition, and a letterhead. Here's J.H. Beam. Now, J.H. Beam was a brother to Jim Beam's father, so he was Jim Beam's uncle. And he was known as Jack Beam. He was the younger brother, and he had a distillery on the Woodlawn Road. Today, it was known as Early Times. And it lasted for quite a while. We'll see a map in a minute. This picture is a pre-1890 view of the business area of Bardstown. As you look north today from the courthouse, if you were here in 1880s, this is what you would have seen looking north. Youngsters out there with their little rings to roll and hoops to roll and all, and wooden buildings. It's a big change today. Now, Mr. J.H. Beam in 1886 had a stone warehouse. It had a whiskey pipe, a log bonded warehouse, the first log warehouse I've seen. But that just shows how long he's been making whiskey on here. Here's his mill room, his fermenters, and his still. The engine over here. And here's his slop line to feed his cattle down here. In 1910, that small distillery has grown to where there's 5 warehouses, a huge cattle shed down here, and here's your gravity-fed slop thing down here. This is the Woodlawn Pike. Today, if you go out that road, you will be getting close to the Woodlawn Springs golf course and subdivision, and you're going to cross this little creek. You'll have to look for it. This is the old railroad line that was there. It's not on this map because it had not been built at this point, but here's the railroad line, and that's how they would ship their product out of there once it came through in 1886. Early Times Distillery. They had sour and sweet mash whiskey. They had all of these different names of brands. Old Turk Distilling, Hartman Robinson, Wright and Pat Taylor. They didn't have a watchman. They ran 7 months a year. They had a water supply from the spring and the creek. And they had about 12, looks like about 15,000 barrels of whiskey. So it was a big operation.